significance of this specific so-called investigation?
I think its most important significance is that there are important challenges in the U.S.-China relationship, and probably at the top of that list is Chinese technology policy and industrial policy. And one component of that is regard to innovation and intellectual property rights. And there's been a long concern in the United States about Chinese IP policies and IP theft, and has had difficulty resolving those through the WTO and through dialogue. So I think what we're seeing now is a change of tactics from the United States to try and reach a more equitable solution.
Two things, Mr. Xu. One is that, isn't it true that the Trump administration does not believe in international trade mechanisms such as WTO? Why referring right now to the WTO for another investigation? That's first thing. The second thing is China-U.S. trade has been increasing so much on the high-tech sector. Sure. That's going to be one of the most significant increase in the future. So can the U.S. also afford these kinds of bad feelings about that part of the trade?
Yeah. As you said correctly, the bilateral trade is extremely important. It's highly entrenched relationship, right? So it's difficult to say who is winning, who is losing. It's just highly entrenched. It's mutual independence. But the fact remains, actually, in the past few years, we have seen this quite a steady increase of trade surplus to China's favor. Of course, we know it doesn't make any sense to talk about trade surplus deficit just between two countries, right? International trade is so complicated. But nevertheless, I think as Scott has said, U.S. has decided to change the tactic, mainly prompted by industrial policy in China. But I also think because what U.S. really wants is greater market access.
So what is really behind this, Mr. Kennedy? You probably could help us to unveil the mystery of the strategy, the so-called art of the deal. Is this going to be part of the, the art of the deal, the stakes for the future negotiation with China for the Trump administration? Or this is just one of those make-up investigations that the Trump administration has to do in order to win so-called hearts and minds of his redneck voters?
I don't think that this is primarily driven by domestic politics. I do think there's been a long-standing concern in the United States about our economic relationship with China, although mutually beneficial across the board and creating millions of jobs for Americans. High tech is the most important part of the American economy, and the most important part of the global economy, which is why China is so focused on it. And there's no criticizing China for trying to move up the value-added chain. It's the methods and the approach. And because China is so large, anything it does has global implications. And I think just the U.S. has felt frustrated. It's brought 18 cases to the WTO, 16 of which have been concluded, 14 they've won. But they haven't received, the commercial benefits from those cases despite the rulings. And so I think before, this may end up back at the WTO by the U.S. or by China.
All right.
But to get there, I think the U.S. is trying to go through 301 first.
All right. But, Mr. Xu, talking about whether 301 investigation or, the steel trade between the United States and some of the other countries, the one that is likely to be most punished is not China. For example, 301 likely to be Japan, South Korea as well. About steel, it's likely to be the European partners, Australia as well. So things are not that black and white. When you say punish China, actually a lot of countries are in the other camp as well. So, Mr. Xu, how does China feel about that?
I think China would also feel very frustrated because 301, it's not about China versus other trading partners, because the very nature of 301 is very unilateral, because that would put U.S. in the position of both a player and a referee. So it is unlikely to go down well.
Well, Mr. Kennedy, a player and a referee at the same time, that's quite busy.
Well, certainly. Both the United States and China have very large economies. Everything they do has global implications. China needs to ask itself, what are the consequences of extensive government intervention in the economy, including in high tech? What's the best, most effective way to help China move up the value-added chain? Is it by engaging in IP theft, or is it by supporting R&D and genuine new innovations and protecting that supply chain? And I think everyone agreed that the latter would be the best way to move forward.
Well, you keep on talking about the so-called IP theft, but you think about China. China has been such a massive market. And when it comes to innovation being tested by the size of the market, it's going to go much further than the United States and even some of the other countries in the world as well. So when people keep on talking about quote-unquote theft as if it were a fact, there are a lot of question marks, Mr. Xu, I have to say.
Yes, indeed. I think China has made a noticeable progress on the IPR front in past few years, mainly because domestic competition, and also because at this stage of economic development, China actually has greater incentive to protect IPR. But I do think Mr. Kennedy has made one valid point, because certain industrial policy may invite retaliation from other trading partners.
So what can China do, Mr. Xu? Because on the one hand, nobody wants to involve into trade disputes. On the other hand, when China's economy is going up, exports still going up, and value-added chain going up the ladder in its industry, it is very natural that somebody else is going to have an issue with it. So what is the best way for China to handle it, including this one with the United States?
I think China should be patient with the United States.
Really?
At the same time, I think China can persuade the United States to allow Chinese companies to make easier inroad for the investment into the United States. At the same time, to open up domestic market further. So that would result in a win-win situation.
Yeah, but what about the other way around, Mr. Xu? That the United States also open up its own market and also invite Chinese investment going over there. There are a lot of political obstacles that we all know.
That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. I do think potentially we could have seen much greater investment from China into the United States, and that's really the ultimate solution for so-called trade imbalance.
Mr. Kennedy, we see the economy are doing very differently these days, China and US. China is focusing on bring up the ladder of this manufacturing, while at the same time encouraging domestic consumption, so-called structural reforms. In the United States, you do have a political situation in which jobs have to be so-called priority, and the numbers have to be shown every day from the Trump administration's Twitter. So what do you make of the very different political environment in both countries and the ability for the two to come together for some mutual growth when it comes to trade, which is good for everyone, Mr. Kennedy?
Tianwei, let me just challenge a little bit with your question. I think actually the political climate in Beijing and Washington, despite the many differences, have a lot of similarities. We have two nationalist governments, both care a lot about jobs, both care about protecting their high-tech sectors and manufacturing. But I think what you've also got a willingness on both sides to, go outside the WTO when they feel it's in their interest. The question is, can we find a balance between the domestic needs and the mutually benefits that come from globalization and international trade? I think that we can. I think there's a lot of steps both China and the United States could take to open up both markets. I'm not in favor of protectionism on either side. It's a hot summer in both places. Hopefully, as we turn toward the fall, cooler heads will prevail, and the investigation will be a starting point for more serious discussions about ways to address these issues.
What you're saying, there were no serious discussions? I mean, there was a so-called 100-day plan from both sides, and then there were some review of the plan by having further dialogue, and now there seems to be more of a hammer rather than the carrots.
Sure. Well, the investigation's not a hammer. So, but the 100-day discussion didn't really touch upon this. If you saw the 10-point agreement issued in May, it touched upon very minor issues, and the 100-day and the comprehensive economic dialogue touched on a lot of things, but they didn't reach agreement on anything related to high tech. And it may seem quick for the Trump administration to act, given that it's only 6 or 7 months in, but this has been a big issue for the relationship for many years. Certainly it was part of the Obama administration's strategic and economic dialogue discussions with China. So we'll see. We're obviously moving into some uncharted territories. No one wants a trade war, but we also want to get these issues resolved.
You know what, Mr. Xu, there's just so many high-tech companies from the United States that are operating here in China. And to many of them, the Chinese market, the size of it has already exceeded their domestic market and their markets elsewhere in the world. So if Beijing retaliate about any further harmful action as Beijing sees it from Washington in this regard, what's going to happen to our trade? And meanwhile, how should both sides think in the long term and the business community react to the actions and reactions from both sides, Mr. Xu?
Well, first of all, I think it's too early to talk about tit for tat measures. I think so far the pronouncement from Chinese government, so far they were quite measured. For example, comments from the MOF Council and so forth. If I were not mistaken, President Trump will be visiting Beijing in a few months' time. I'm sure there will be a continued discussion beyond 100-day program. I'm also quite certain, and China is already prepared to open up its domestic market in a meaningful way in certain sectors.
Interesting. Well, you probably had more inside information than I do. Mr. Kennedy, before we go, Mr. Bannon is gone from the White House. He was the one proclaimed there's going to be a trade war. Everything else is just decoration of policies for the White House right now. He's gone. Does that mean there's not likely to be so-called a overall trade war? What's going to happen with China-U.S. trade? Can the two sides work well with real articulation?
Sure. I think there has been sort of three voices inside the Trump administration. One side sees the relationship basically as fine and needs modest tinkering. At the other extreme, Bannon and his crowd who thinks China's the biggest problem on the global stage, and then a group in the middle who thinks there are problems in the current relationship between the U.S. and China, but they can be fixed, and you might need to put more pressure on China. I think we're now, even though Bannon's wing is much more weakened, we're now, Lighthizer probably is in this middle camp. And so I think we should expect the coming months to see more pressure and maybe more tensions. But I think the goal is to improve the relationship, not become permanent rivals.